So we're going to begin right back at the start here with Arthur Guinness. I'm sure most of you will have heard of Arthur Guinness before, but Arthur Guinness was born in 1725 near Selbridge. In 1752, he was left £100 in a will from his godfather, Arthur Price. He originally used this money to set up a brewery in Leixlip, but in 1759, as you can see over the gate there, he moved the brewery to St. James's Gate, purchasing a 4-acre site. The Liberties was a very popular area for whiskey distilling and brewing. There were 8 breweries already in the James's Gate and Thomas Street area. There were 35 overall, and there were over 70 whiskey distilleries. The Arthur managed to sign a 9,000-year lease with Dublin Corporation to lease the site here, and it also secured his water source. So that lease is actually encased in glass in the floor of the lobby of the Guinness storehouse, which some of you may have visited before. This was Arthur's house here on Thomas Street, and it remained in the Guinness family up until the time of his grandson, Benjamin Lee, who we'll hear about in a little while. So he lived there. He fathered 20 children, though sadly only 11 of them actually made it to adulthood. So even the effects of life in Dublin didn't escape the more well-off. Where we are here is around the back at the Guinness Storehouse attraction at the Grand Canal Basin. A lot of people assume Guinness is actually made with Liffey water. It's actually made with water that would have come from the Grand Canal. And just across the street here, we'll see where the Grand Canal Basin would have joined up with the storehouse. It's behind the scaffold in there. So despite my best efforts to climb over, couldn't get any good footage. They're digging it all up at the moment, probably to build apartments or something. So they boiled the canal water, which would have come down from where the Lewis runs in Rialto now, in around the storehouse sites. So the storehouse buildings you see here, they were part of the expansion under Edward Cecil Guinness, who was the great-grandson of Arthur, and we'll hear a lot about him later on, and his title, Lord Ivegh. So this was originally a massive fermentation centre that is now a popular tourist attraction. They stopped using it in the 1980s. So Guinness is brewed here, now on site down at Victoria Quay. Guinness operated 45 licensed breweries all over the world. They own 5 of them, 3 of which were in Africa. Up until 2007, they had a place in Park Royal in London as well. And they're recently opening one in Baltimore. But all the Guinness you buy in the world on tap comes from here. You see the truck there taking it down to the ports. Other places, they bottle the Guinness and they sell it off. So this is the Diageo main global supply, and about 10 million pints of Guinness are consumed every day in the world. So a lot of the innovations in industry came around through Guinness as well. It was the largest brewery in the world within 100 years of it being founded. It was the first place to ever have a typewriter as well in its office in Ireland, which I discovered earlier on today. So the story of Guinness contributing to life in Dublin, and particularly public works, begins here with Benjamin Lee Guinness. So he was the grandson of Arthur Guinness and the son of Arthur Guinness II. When Arthur II died in 1855, Benjamin Lee took over the company. Arthur Guinness himself actually lived up to the age of 90, so it explains the large span in the difference between the son and grandson. But Benjamin Lee was a very religious man. He was a member of the congregation of St. Patrick's Cathedral here, the Anglican Cathedral. We're viewing Patrick's Cathedral from the back here, and I'll explain why in a second. So a lot of the Anglican congregation had diminished, particularly after the Act of Union in Ireland and the 1798-1803 rebellions. So the church over the next 50 years fell into quite a bad state of disrepair. But Benjamin Lee actually stumped up the money to pay for the whole restoration of the church. They were considering knocking the entire thing down and rebuilding it, because such was the extent of the damage and the repairs needed to the church there. However, he stipulated that no architect be hired. He wanted to design the whole thing himself. So he kind of did it on the fly a little bit. He knocked down a lot of the walls that would have separated the choir from the rest of the congregation, and some of the naves up along the sides as well. So it opened out into a kind of a big crucifix shape. Anyone who's been in St. Patrick's Cathedral, it's the largest one in Ireland, will be familiar with the big open space in there. And if you haven't been in, I definitely recommend going in to check it out. You'll see here that the roof is needing another reconstruction. So this is the first major job since the Guinness restoration. So the Guinness works were finished in 1865, and this statue of Benjamin Lee was commissioned there a couple of years after his death in 1868. So he only lived for 3 years afterwards. He did specify that he didn't want any particular recognition for his contribution. He just said that it was a humble act done by a man who had nothing to offer but his devotion to his God, and that's why he wanted to contribute it. But £150,000 in the 1860s was an absolutely astonishing amount of money. Upon his death in 1868, Benjamin Lee Guinness was the richest man in Ireland. With the money then, he also contributed to this little building in around the back of St. Patrick's Cathedral. This is Marsh's Library, and it's the oldest public library in Dublin. I don't know if anyone has ever been inside here before. It predates the library at Trinity College by about 30 years or so. Marsh's Library was notorious for book theft, and they still have cages in there that they used to lock readers inside while they were reading. So it's like a little jail cell with a couple of shelves. It was particularly popular with Jonathan Swift, who became Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral right after Archbishop Marsh, and Bram Stoker used to visit the library quite a lot as well. It's about £3 to go in. So if you're in the area, stick your head in and give them a little bit of support. They do a lot of things for kids as well. If anyone has any young children, they kind of hide little Lego figures of famous authors around it and things like that. They shot parts of Michael Collins in there as well. So we move on from Benjamin Lee Guinness to his son. His son is Arthur Guinness III, otherwise known as Lord Ardilaun. So you'll see here at St. Stephen's Green, the statue of Arthur. The Guinnesses purchased a property at Stephen's Green, which is known as now as Ivegh House, that was purchased under Benjamin Lee. Arthur resided there as well. So Arthur Guinness III, Lord Ardilaun, he was involved with the brewery after Benjamin died, but after about 8 or 9 years, he sold his shares in the company to his brother. He was bought out at a cost of £686,000. Again, this is in the 1870s. This is an absolutely astonishing amount of money. So that made his brother made him extraordinarily rich on the back of being bought out. He was more involved in politics. He was elected as MP for Dublin for the Conservative Unionist Party. He was a staunch unionist and backed the unionist cause with his money very strongly. But he continued to work on St. Patrick's Cathedral. He paid in particular for the floor to be redesigned along the style of the original medieval tiles. His brother Edward, who we'll hear about in a few minutes, paid for the bells and the organ to be rehoused as well. But his major contribution to Dublin was the purchasing of Stephen's Green Park. So the Guinnesses, as residents of Stephen's Green, were entitled to a key to the park, which was private. Eventually, Ardilaun here started buying out all of the other residents around the square, and he made the park public then in the year 1880. So he was awarded the title Lord Ardilaun for these good works, and he lived in the house at St. Anne's Park. He also lived out in Ashford Castle on the Galway-Mayo border there. The statue that you see here in Stephen's Green, this was erected in 1892 as a thanks to him for his donation of the park to the public of Dublin. He also paid for the Coombe Hospital to be pretty much rebuilt as well. Just an interesting little bit of trivia there, if anyone has any family Zoom quizzes coming up as well. It's the only statue of a father and son in Dublin. The previous one we saw, Benjamin Lee Guinness and Arthur Guinness III here. So this man here, this is Edward Cecil Guinness. Edward Cecil Guinness is otherwise known as Lord Ivegh. Now, unlike his brother Arthur, who had been educated in Eton and spent most of his time involved in politics, Edward Cecil began an apprenticeship at the brewery himself from the age of 15. He married his second cousin, Adelaide Maria Guinness, in 1873. She was a patron of the Adelaide Hospital, which bears her name as well. Between them, then, they purchased Farm Lee the year later, where they spent most of their time living there and in between there and London. But over in London, they continued to climb the social ladder. They eventually befriended the Prince of Wales, who had a particular interest in improving housing conditions around London and other parts of the British Commonwealth. He himself did make a few attempts to get elected to the British Parliament, but he wasn't particularly successful. But he remained chairman of the board of Guinness until the 1890s. He came back then in the early 1900s, taking a more hands-on role in Guinness. In 1886, he floated Guinness on the London Stock Exchange, and this brought him in a value of about £6 million. Again, that's not adjusted for inflation. So he then became undoubtedly the richest man in Ireland. He still retained control of about a third of the company overall. He spent most of his time in London, but he was generally head of the board of Guinness and was kept up to date on all the affairs that were going on in Guinness. But once he took a bit of a backseat from around 1890 onwards, he started getting involved much more heavily in charitable causes. So he was given the title Lord Ivegh in 1890. So we'll all be familiar with the name of the Iveagh Trust. So this is where it comes from, this man here. But as I said, his working life at the brewery brought him into close contact with all workers that would have lived there. There were chronic problems in social life in Ireland in the 19th century. Cholera had been a big epidemic that was largely under control at this point, but TB was still killing a huge amount of people. About 40% of the people that worked at Guinness who died of TB alone, so it was a serious effort. From around the 1870s, then he starts building houses for the workers at Guinness, particularly near the brewery and in parts of places like Rialto as well. And by the time that Guinness went public in 1886, about 14% of workers who worked at Guinness were living in houses built by the company. Along with his brother, then they founded another company called the Dublin Artisans Dwelling Company. So all the areas around, say, Arbor Hill and places like that would have been built by them. So there's sort of two up, two down workers style houses. That wasn't a charity, but it was still they built quite a lot for workers of Dublin. But here's where the Iveagh Trust really begins. So this is the Kevin Street block. The curved block you see in the front there was built between the 1930s and the 1950s. But just around behind there, they built some of the larger complexes there. I got a better shot of it from the laneway around the back. I'll show you now in a moment. So they announced plans to build houses for the poor, not only of Dublin, but of London as well. Out of the budget of $250,000, only 50,000 was actually allocated for Dublin. So about 4/5 of it went on the London projects there. The tenements in Dublin were some of the worst in Europe. The slum deaths in Dublin were the highest in Europe. The amount of people living in slums was higher in London, but the amount of people that actually died was the highest in Dublin. Some tenement houses, as I mentioned, would have contained over 100 people. They would have had a single tap in the backyard all to share. So disease spread very, very quickly around the area. One shocking statistic from the Dublin South Ward, which was where this building was at the time that it was built, 62% of children didn't even live until their 10th birthday. Another statistic was that if you were from a middle class area and you had a six times higher chance of surviving childhood than you did from living in one of the poorer working class areas or slums. But the area that we're on now, on the other side of St. Patrick's Cathedral, is probably the more visible buildings in the Iveagh Trust that some of us will know. So this is the Bull Alley complex. So Edward secured an act of legislation in 1889 called the Dublin Bull Alley area. So that merged with what was known as the Guinness Trust to create the Iveagh Trust in his own name that same year. So about the time that this building was built, they were already housed about 1,000 people. So there was about 250 flats in the Kevin Street area as well. But the Bull Alley complex that we see here, the sum total of money involved to build this one was greater than the Kevin Street and the London complexes combined. So this cost over £300,000. There was a little bit of criticism actually of the Iveagh Trust. I know some people who live there won't say a bad word about it, but at the time you had to prove that you had a certain amount of income, you had to prove certain hygiene standards. You even had to have proof of vaccination as well, which is a very prescient sort of theme here. They weren't allowed to keep pets or take in any laundry from anyone who lived outside of the area. What we see here is Ivegh House, now known as Ivegh Hostel. So in addition to permanent homes for the workers and the poor of Dublin, there was a hostel set up. The hostel was set up to contain 508 beds. Each bed had its own window, but it was separated by wooden dividers. The dividers went almost all the way to the roof, but they had to leave a little bit of ventilation between it as well. So they were really sanitized and modern conditions compared to the slums. They were tiled, which was helped with cleaning and keeping disease down as well. But in addition to the beds, they had other facilities for the men that stayed there. It was men only, single men only. They had barbers, kind of recreation room, a smoking room, a dining hall, and some laundry facilities as well. So a lot of the people that stayed at the hostel, they would have actually just moved from the countryside to Dublin and stayed a couple of nights until they found a more permanent residence or digs. And across the street here, then we have the Ivy Baths. So this is on Bride Road at the back of Bull Alley, just off St. Patrick's Street. So the baths here, at the turn of the 20th century, not a lot of people would have bathed at home. The Iveagh Trust buildings had a bath or had wash facilities shared per floor. But you could go down to the baths, you could rent out a little private booth that had both cold and hot water as well. In the centre, there was a swimming pool for recreation that was surrounded by a kind of very ornate galley that people could go in and observe. So one woman who was on the talk last night recalls going to the Ivy Baths back in the 1950s, I assume. And she said that everyone went there, but nobody could swim. So the shallow end was crowded. The rest of it was completely empty as well. They had natural light coming in through the roof box that you'll see up the top there. But after dark, they were able to light it with lamps as well. They actually had a water purification plant installed there to keep the things clean. And they had some laundry facilities as well for people in the area that wanted to come and do the washing, etc. So I should say at this point that I myself, don't have any particular family connections to the Iveagh Trust, although my great grandfather did work for Guinness. So this is not my story. This is just a history of the area. However, I would like to share some of the words of people who did live there, who kindly contributed their stories, both to videos and to annual reports, which are put out by the Trust every year. I'll tell you a little bit about a woman called Carmel Murphy. So in 2018, she spoke to the Iveagh Trust as they were putting their annual report together. She had been living in the Trust since 1931. When she moved in, her family had been living in nearby, and she moved in at 7 months old. So according to her, there were about 40 children on each of the corridor. Most of the time was spent playing outside in the yard at the back of the play centre, which we'll talk about in the last section. Carmel describes her home as a two-room dwelling that she shared with her parents and two siblings. She recalls vividly the smell of laundry being done on the Wednesday by her mother. They had a single aluminium bath, which would be placed in front of the fireside. She talks about how they didn't have that much growing up, despite the fact that her parents worked. Her father was in employment the entire time, but they weren't entitled to any other welfare or supports outside the Iveagh Trust. The one thing that comes across from it is the community spirit, though. I'm going to quote directly from her. We had lovely neighbours. Mammy might make a bit of rice today and bring some up to you, and then something else tomorrow, and they'd give us a bit. If you'd no money, it didn't matter. Someone would give you something. And we'd be going to fill a kettle or an empty basin. You'd meet someone coming up or down the stairs, and you'd stand and talk for ages. You'd meet someone all the time. It's a really lovely place to live, a great place to live, really. Another woman that lived there for quite a long time was a woman called Nellie Malloy. She had been living there since 1915. Nellie worked as a weaver over the canal bridge there in Harold's Cross at Greenmount for 27 years. She then retired to look after her mother. She never married herself. And when her mother died in 1967, Nellie remained at the complex until 2002, when she sadly passed away. But members of her family then, her extended family, actually worked with the Iveagh Trust to preserve the flat as it was. So they'd offered, for example, to install a bathroom in her flat on a couple of occasions, and she refused every time. It just so happened that quite a lot of the things in the flat were pretty much unchanged since the 1920s. So the trust bought out all the furniture and they opened it then as a little private museum. So you're allowed to go in and see Mrs. Malloy's flat as it would have been back in the 1920s. You get in touch with the Iveagh Trust through their website, and they let you in by private appointment. So by the time of the death of Edward Cecil Guinness, Lord Ivy, in 1927, about 2,000 people were housed in Iveagh Trust between Bull Alley here and Kevin Street. And it was estimated that in his lifetime, Edward Cecil Guinness probably gave about 1.5 million, again, not adjusted for inflation, to charitable causes. However, one scholar has estimated his total net worth throughout his entire life might have even been as high as about 40 million pounds. Again, an astonishing amount of money. Someone asked in the chat there, what would that be? I'm not sure the exact conversion from the old money with inflation. The cost of Patrick's Cathedral was about 100,000, which I think works out at about 5 million in today's money. So if you can do the maths from there, he undoubtedly would have been the equivalent of a billionaire in today's money. He would have been top of the rich list. He was the richest man in Ireland, as I mentioned, throughout his lifetime. This is Bull Alley. So this is the street off the side of St. Patrick's Park, where the Liberties College Bull Alley complex was originally made. So the Bull Alley was notoriously dirty, rundown slum area. It was particularly full of butchers and brothels. All but 4 of the shops on the street were actually butchers. One newspaper describes it as a maze of tortuous alleys and lanes, which cannot be equaled in the city anywhere today. There, everything seemed to be stale. Meat jostled with the discarded clothing which was for sale, and the odours encountered in a walk through the district would nowadays call for the assistance of a gas mask. That was written about 25 years after the slums had been knocked down. So Lord Ivy himself actually purchased the entire site, and it was level. So this was done around the time that the houses were being built behind us there. They created a public park in order to grant a kind of a place of fresh air in the crowded area, and also to be a kind of a centerpiece to the cathedral, on which his father and his brother had done a lot of work. So the park was redesigned. The elevation you can see here originally had benches on it. It was also used as a bandstand from time to time. And it was opened by King Edward VII in 1902. So very little in the park has actually changed from its design. They've added a playground and a couple of public sculptures and artworks and things like that. But what of the market traders that used to work there? Well, to compensate the market traders, Lord Ivy built a market complex just a couple of streets away up on Francis Street. So this was known as the Ivy Markets, which you can see just on the capital of the building there. So the Ivy Market again was paid for by Lord Ivy at a cost of £50,000. Although not all the traders were happy with having to be moved off. Some of them actually tried to take him to court, although I don't think they were successful in that. So the market was a modern and a sanitized facility which continued to trade right up until the 1990s. So traders could rent a pitch on a casual lease in the hall in the center. So you'd have to bring down your wares during the day. It was mostly things like secondhand clothes and household goods and all of that sort of stuff as well. The market on the opposite lane here, this is the Dean Swift Court. On the other side of the building, they actually installed another laundry. As I said, most of the clothes being sold were second-hand clothes, so they would have cleaned them and aired them out. And again, they had modern machinery invested for cleaning and drying. The gates at the back there on Lamb Alley, that was the entrance to the fish and vegetable market as well. Just back at the top of the street here, this little bust you see at the top, that's supposed to be Edward Cecil Guinness, Lord Ivy himself. So that's one of about 7 busts in the keystones that frame the Ivy Market buildings in total. We don't actually know who the other ones are supposed to represent. The Dublin Council rather carried out a survey of the building in recent years due to its state of disrepair. and no one involved in the 100-page report was able to dig up who they were meant to be. There's theories that due to their kind of stylings of beards and head wrappings and all that sort of stuff, that they might represent different continents around the world or different countries that might have traded with people here in Ireland. So even as far back as the 1960s, there was talk of the Ivy markets coming into financial trouble and that it might have to shut down, but it lingered on until the 1990s. In 1997, hotel owner and publican and developer Martin Keane purchased the site from the council on a 500-year lease. But despite talk of developing the site, it was actually left to ruin. And eventually he argued that it would cost too much to restore, so it ought to be just knocked down and a hotel and apartments and a music venue be put there in its place. However, December 2020, the saga of the markets encountered another dramatic twist. The current Lord Ivegh is also Edward Guinness. He's Lord Ivegh IV, sent in a security team overnight to reclaim the markets in the name of the people. So according to the original legislation for the markets, if it fell into disrepair, the ownership would actually revert automatically back to the Guinness family. So he invoked this and he's claimed the markets now himself. He put the Christmas tree back, which was an annual feature outside the markets that you can just see there as well. So his intention is to restore it as a place that would benefit the community, such was its original intention. However, Martin Keane is planning to take a legal challenge against the claim of ownership by Lord Ivegh, but hopefully whatever's done with it, it'll live up to its original intention as well. So we're back around here at Bull Alley that we saw in the photograph a few minutes ago. This splendid building here, this was kind of the jewel in the crown of the Iveagh Trust. This was the Iveagh Play Centre. It's by far the most ornate architecturally of all of the Iveagh buildings in the area. So the Iveagh Play Centre was constructed as a sort of an after-school activity place for kids from the local area. You didn't have to be from the Iveagh Trust, but that's what it was originally set up for. The play centre was estimated to have cost about £38,000, again, contributed entirely by Lord Ivegh. So it was for kids between the age of 3 and 14 who would have gone for after-school activities and things like that. So it contained several classrooms where they were able to learn new crafts, a gymnasium, and an assembly hall, which also doubled up as a concert hall. I'm just going to take you into the assembly hall here now. So the Christmas concerts were particularly renowned. But again, cleanliness was paramount. You see there around the walls, the green tiles, they're original. And you'll see below us kind of a hardwood interlock floor. So it was much easier to keep these surfaces clean as well. The centre itself has a nickname. It's known locally as the Bayno, which you can see down below there. Now, I've heard a few different theories as to where the name Bayno comes from over the years. The one I heard was that when you went to the Bayno, you were given cocoa and a bun. So you ask anyone about this and they'll remember the cocoa and the bun. But they didn't grind the beans and the cocoa down particularly well. So it was floating with beans. And as we all know in the Dublin parlance, beans are banes. And this is where the Bayno comes from. A more likely explanation is that Bayno is actually an old word for Beano, which was a sort of a 19th century fete or a festival or something like that. So it essentially means a kind of a big party in the old ways. But either way, it was known as the Bayno. The yard you see here, this is where boys played football and rounders. There was even a piano brought out to the yard on occasion. Some of the adults would sit around supervising all of the children as well. They had a big maypole there, so the May week festivals are particularly big. I'm just going to read again from Carmel Murphy, who we heard about earlier on, who recalls her time at the Bayno. She says, I went to the Bayno for embroidery. Seamus, that was her brother, went for basket making, and Marie went for the dancing. But believe it or not, I never had the bun and cocoa. That time they did the bun and cocoa for all the kids. I didn't like it myself. I didn't like the currant in the bun either. There was actually more kids from outside than inside went to the Bayno, but my sister lived in it for the dancing. She loved it. We'd come home from school at 4 o'clock and went straight in there. During the Second World War, they actually built a bomb shelter out the back in the yard, but they didn't have cause to need for it. Here in the lobby, they have some photographs of the Bayno itself going back throughout the years. So you'll see here the children enjoying one of the playrooms. So they had things like table tennis set up. There were big slides put in from time to time as well. The window you see in the top of the photograph here, that's the kind of first floor of the building nowadays. There's a false floor in there. So anyone familiar with its current iteration is the Liberties College. They're the classrooms on the first floor, but you can actually go down into the basement. And again, a lot of the tiles are still there around the walls. You'll see another photograph here now in a second of some of the classes that took place at the Bayno. So the Iveagh Trust actually paid teachers to come in and give the classes, but there was no charge to use any of the classes from any of the people who took part. So the boys would come in on some days, girls would come in on other days. But because people were living in big families, if you were 10 or 12 years old, you'd have to bring your little brother or sister down as well, so that nobody would be left out. They had nurseries in there and tea sets for kids to play with, drafts. There was a library that was particularly popular, especially with the boys, for the comic books and all that sort of stuff as well. But the demand for the after-school facilities in the Bayno started to wane in the 1960s, and it ran into a little bit of financial trouble. Obviously, it wasn't generating any of its own revenue. So the trust then began to lease classrooms out to the Vocational Education Committee, the VEC, in the 60s. In 1976, then the VEC actually bought out the entire building. So it's used as a school now. It's the Liberties College. So you'll see here the classrooms have been repurposed. As I mentioned, I'm giving this talk on behalf of the Liberties College, so I'll just give a little plug for them. If anyone's thinking of going to any sort of adult education, the curriculum at the college is quite extensive. So you can study everything from things like care work to media. You can even study tourism and tour guiding if you like, and get a national tour guiding badge. So the full range of courses available on their website. It's www.libertiescollege.ie, and I'll just give you a little idea of some of the things that are available here. So you can see there: childcare, youth community, creative arts, counselling, tourism, etc., etc. So they're coming up on their 50th celebration here as well. So it'll be 50 years come 1976, but they'd started to do stuff there, as I mentioned, from the 1960s onwards. I'm just going to finish up here now with a little legend that relates to the building. So this is part of the original drawings of the front elevation. If you just look above the windows there on the western wing, you'll see there are two statues. There are actually four statues. There were two on each wing. They're no longer there. The story is that the boy who was used by the sculptor as the model to carve these statues actually died while he was very young. And on the night that he died, his mother was seen walking up and down Hull Alley, just wailing with grief. When they came to the college building then, or the play centre building the next morning, the statues had disappeared. So these are four statues weighing half a ton that are 20 feet up the air, that had completely disappeared, and nobody knows whatever came of the statues. If anyone has the answer to that, maybe you'll contribute that to us in the chat afterwards. So I'll just sum up now. As we've heard a lot about Edward Cecil Guinness, Lord Ivy, the Iveagh Trust still operates at the moment. They're still the largest housing charity and the oldest housing charity here in Ireland. They manage about 1,600 units all the way around, particularly the Dublin area. They still have the sites in London as well. Someone who was on the meeting last night was talking to us about spending time in the London one. Sadly, the Ivy Hostel that we saw runs at full capacity year in, year out now due to persistent homeless crisis that we're undergoing. Edward Cecil Guinness's son, Rupert Guinness, eventually gave Ivy House and the Ivy Gardens Park again as a gift to the public in 1939. St. Anne's Park eventually became public after it passed on from ownership from the Guinnesses as well. In the 1920s then, they decided to branch out and create the Ivy Gardens up in Crumlin. So they were a kind of a larger house that you could rent very much outside the city. It was all considered a kind of a country estate at the time. Because they were larger, the rent was actually a bit more expensive. And they ended up selling their ownership of those buildings then in the 1970s. So previously you had to rent it out from the Guinness family as well. They've other complexes that they continue to build. The thinking was that once the Iveagh Trust made about a 3% return on rent, and that was with keeping rents at the average level. The rent for a house in the Iveagh Trust was what it would have been for single room in a tenement. So it was quite a good deal for people who live there. So provided they got about 3% every year, they could use that to reinvest and keep building in houses. So they're still building. They're building in Swords. They built places out in Leopardstown, in Clonee, I believe, as well. And 10 years ago, they built one of the most recent ones, which is Elvin House on Cork Street, just above the Lidl there, if anyone's familiar with the Cork Street area. So we've quite a lot to thank Edward Cecil, Lord Ivy here for. So I think apart from raising a glass to Arthur, maybe we'll raise a glass to him the next time. And hopefully we'll see some of the wealthy people try and take up the mantle the next year, maybe sort out the housing crisis.